Welcome again to Cooking at the Lake. Today we're very fortunate because we're at the home of Judy and Tony Fish, and their daughter is joining us today, and it's the family edition. So we have Judy and her daughter, and hopefully we'll have your little baby with us too today. So that's who's joining us, and today we're making challah, which is a type of bread. So yes. Hannah, thank you for being here and showing us what we can do. Now, first we start with the ingredients, if that's okay with you. Can you tell us what we're going to use today?
Yeah, sure. So today we're going to be using olive oil, flour, yeast, salt, some sugar. You can do granulated sugar, you can do honey, whatever you prefer, and then a bunch of eggs.
Oh, that sounds great. And brown eggs, that's nice. That's wonderful. Well, now there's some tradition that goes along with the bread, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, in the Jewish faith, challah bread symbolizes so many different things. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So what we think of as challah today is a type of braided bread that comes from Eastern Europe, from the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition. But really what the word challah means in Hebrew, it's referring to a portion that Jews would take from the dough during the days of the temple. Basically in Judaism, we always give part of what we have to God, whether that's giving a portion of your salary to charity, or giving some of your crops if you're involved in agriculture. And then another one of those things is dough. So in the days of the temple, the portion of the dough that would be given was called challah. We no longer have a temple. God willing, one day will be rebuilt. But now, to remember that, we still take a portion of the dough when we're making the challah in remembrance of that.
Now, I remember you said something about that you burn it possibly as an offering. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, so generally to get rid of that small piece of challah that you take from the challah, you would burn it. You can otherwise dispose of it in some other ways too, but that's the traditional method.
That is fascinating. Well, it's such a beautiful loaf of bread too. Just the aspect of it. So you're going to show us all how to make it and what to use. And if you don't mind, we'll talk about the tradition as we go along. Okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
So what's the first thing we do?
Yeah, so the first thing you're going to want to do is take a cup and 3/4 of water, and warm water, and you're going to put it in a big bowl with a tablespoon of sugar, and then 3 3/4 about teaspoons of the yeast.
Okay, all right.
And so you'll dissolve the sugar and then put the yeast on top. If you're dealing with packets, that's like a packet and a half of yeast. If you have the bigger box, you can do the teaspoons. And you would just sprinkle that over the warm water. Leave it for 10 to 15 minutes to proof. And you'll start to see it look nice and foamy. On a day like today where it's humid, that happens quicker. When it's colder, you might have to wait a little bit longer, but you want to make sure your yeast has proofed. At that point, you'll start incorporating the other ingredients.
Okay, now when you put in the eggs and the water is warm, is there something particularly that you do so it doesn't like cook the eggs?
So that's good, yeah. So good point. The water shouldn't be hot enough to cook eggs. It should just be lukewarm. And by the time the yeast has proofed, it will cool down to room temperature.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So that's a good tip. From watching, British Bake Show, I remember something about the eggs. So that's great. That's fantastic. Okay, so you've got your water that's risen with your yeast. What's the next step?
Once we have the warm water with the yeast proof.
Yeah,
so once the yeast has proofed in the water, the next step will be to start to incorporate the other ingredients. You have your eggs. You'll take 4 eggs, crack them in one at a time, and whisk them in.
Yes.
After the eggs are incorporated, next I normally do the olive oil. So you're going to do half a cup. It can be olive oil, it can be canola oil, any neutral oil that you want to use. I usually do olive oil. Once you have that, you would add the sugar. So it's going to be a half cup of sugar or honey. I prefer to use honey.
Now, is there some semblance in the faith that has honey and apples, maybe?
Yeah. You're thinking of Rosh Hashanah. So for the Jewish New Year, which is called Rosh Hashanah, one of our customs is to dip apples in honey and make a blessing over them. For Rosh Hashanah, people will also make a special challah, usually in the shape of a circle, to sort of symbolize like the cyclical nature of the year. And they might incorporate chopped apples with honey or seasonings like into the challah braid itself.
Wow.
So people like to do sort of special things with the challah when it comes to different Jewish holidays.
I see. Now, when you put the olive oil in it, it's part of the mixture, just like the sugar and the eggs.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
You're just at this point still just whisking everything together.
Okay.
Then you're going to do the salt, which is a tablespoon of salt.
Okay.
Make sure everything's incorporated. And once we have all of that together, we'll start to add in the flour, which is where things get more interesting. So you'll want to have 8.5 cups of flour ready, but you'll want to see how the dough comes together because it really depends on things like the humidity and your level of, are you above sea level and all of that. So you'll see how much you need, and when you have enough, you don't have to keep adding all
Okay. Now, will it be like a sticky consistency, or will it be more smooth, or how will it look?
So it will eventually be smooth. So you'll start to incorporate the flour. I find that normally the first 3 cups of flour I can continue to whisk, and they'll sort of start to look like pancake batter.
Oh, okay, yeah.
At that point, I'll switch to a spoon so you don't get your whisk too mucked up. And keep adding in, half cup of flour at a time, and just watch that consistency of the dough. Okay. Once it starts to look really shaggy and it's getting thicker and it's getting harder to incorporate the flour, you're going to want to dump it out on something where you can start incorporating the flour by hand.
Okay.
You'll eventually form the ball will start to become smoother, and that's when you'll start to think about kneading. And so we do have some dough to demonstrate.
Okay. So once we've gotten the dough mixed up together, is this what the consistency looks like when you feel comfortable to start kneading?
Basically, yeah. It'll probably be a little shaggier than this when you're doing it. This has been sitting out while we've been talking, so you can tell it's already even starting to rise a little bit. It's a little bit poofy. So when you're bringing it over from the bowl, it'll be less poofy. It'll be a little bit shaggier. You'll have sort of this more of this texture across the dough.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead, and I recommend always taking rings off when you're going to be kneading like this.
Yes.
I would make sure, any flour that you're still trying to incorporate, you just have out on whatever, you're using.
Surface, yes.
That's the word.
Yes, I love that word, surface.
Surface you're using. And so for kneading the dough, you're going to want to give it a good 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
One of the biggest mistakes people make when they're doing challah is they don't knead for long enough, and that's going to give you a really dense bread. And what we want is a really nice, fluffy, soft bread.
Yes.
So you definitely want to knead long enough.
Okay.
You don't really run the risk of over kneading with your hands.
Now that's interesting because some breads or some types of recipes, they're like, oh, hardly touch it at all. Like biscuits, I think, or something like that. But with challah, you can knead all day long. Is that it?
The only way you're going to over knead this is if you're throwing it into like your KitchenAid mixer, which people do, and that's fine. But then you'd have to watch it. When you're doing it with your hands, your arms will get tired way before the bread is over kneaded.
Now there's some semblance to kneading the bread. Can you tell me a little bit about how sometimes you were saying earlier that there's when we were talking that some women get together and they knead bread together?
Yeah, so something that's interesting about challah is it's really considered a women's mitzvah or commandment. In Judaism, there are several that are specific to women. Not that a man can't do it, but there's something special about it for women. And so it's pretty popular for women to come together and do big challah bakes together. If someone is sick, you might have 40 women who are making challah sign up to pray for the person while they're making challah. Making challah is considered a time when you can pray for people. Specifically, when you take that piece of challah, you could pray for people who are ill, who would like to have children, who would like to get married, anything, who need more financial livelihood, anything like that. There's a special thing with challah where you can pray. And then when you actually physically knead the challah, when I learned to make challah, the woman who taught me said that as you knead, it's a good idea to really think about all of the things that you want for yourself, for your family, for the week ahead. And you put all your love and energy into the bread as you're kneading it, and that will make the challah taste better.
Yes.
And it will make it more special for when you sit down with your family to have it on Shabbat.
That is so touching. It truly is. And it's a thoughtful process.
Yeah, it's something special. So when we knead it, we're just going to basically take one side of the challah and bring it over and
there we go. There you put muscle into it. There you go. Okay. Oh, and just keep pushing it like that.
And you're going to push it like this.
You know, other people think about getting their frustrations out, huh? Now, that's a different spin on it, to pray
that's another way you can do it. I think it's kind of nice to do the,
praying.
Yeah, and the nice, happy intentions for the week.
That's
for your
wonderful.
family.
Now, with Shabbat, you also explain a little bit about the timeline and what you can and can't do during Shabbat, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So for Shabbat, which starts Friday night at sunset and ends Saturday night at nightfall, there are a number of things we don't do, but also a lot of things we specifically do for Shabbat.
Okay.
So on Shabbat, we do not engage in any acts of creative work.
Okay.
We don't change anything in our environment intentionally. So we don't use electricity, we don't build things, we don't handle money, we don't write, we don't tear paper, we don't cook, we don't use our phones, our computers, our TVs. And so basically what we do on Shabbat is that we have a day of rest.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that just like God spent 6 days creating the world and then took a day of rest, so too we emulate that, and we work for 6 days and then rest on the 7th, which is Shabbat for us.
Mm-hmm.
And we would pray, sleep, go on walks, play board games, read. So it's really just a day to spend with family, engaged in more, spiritual pursuits.
Yes.
We have several meals. So one is the Friday night dinner. And then we have a special lunch on Shabbat. And then we have a third meal on Shabbat, which is sort of in the afternoon. These days with the long summer days, it's basically dinner time again.
Yes.
But for the first 2 meals, we are required to have 2 loaves of bread.
I see.
And that symbolizes the double portion of the man that the Israelites had in the desert.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's why we have 2 to remember that.
Okay.
We make a blessing over wine. We make a blessing over the bread. First, we wash our hands. Then we make the blessing and eat the bread. And then we have our meal. There are certain songs we sing, and at a Shabbat table, you would want to talk about, nice topics, spiritual topics.
Yes.
It's supposed to be something that's really set apart and special, different from your normal, weeknight dinner meal.
It's kind of such a special time because you really focus on your family and what's meaningful in your life and talking out things, in this day and age, that's so rare that you have a minute to sit down. Some folks don't even sit down together with dinner one night a week, much less, once a week or every night.
And with no cell phones.
Yes. Oh, that makes a difference too. But I just think it's so wonderful that there's so much meaning behind every step of the meal too.
Mm-hmm.
So now when you start to do the bread, do you start it like on Tuesday, Wednesday? How do you prepare for Friday when you can't do anything after Friday evening?
Right. So it really depends on the person and their schedule. So in a family where everybody's working, everybody's busy, a lot of people do start preparing for Shabbat on Wednesday, Thursday night. They make all their food. That means that when you come home from work on Friday, you're just chopping up some salads and you're ready to go. So for me, I usually make the challah every other week. So I'll make enough for 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes 3 if I'm feeling ambitious. And then I'll freeze the rest. So the nice thing with challah is if you freeze the challah soon after it's out of the oven, right after it's cooled down, when you reheat it, it will taste like it was freshly baked.
Oh, nice.
So
you wouldn't like freeze the dough. You would cook the bread and you would freeze the bread.
Yeah, I've tried both ways. There are people who freeze the dough, but I find that it tastes much better and it's much easier to just have the loaf frozen. When you're dealing with frozen dough, you have to bring it back up to the right temperature.
Yes.
It takes a very long time, and I find that the taste is honestly better when the bread is completely done. Yeah.
Well, I've made platted bread. They didn't call it challah when I've made it, and you know how shiny it is. Well, I took plastic wrap and I put the plastic wrap on top to rise it, but then I forgot to take the plastic wrap off and I put it in the oven, and it was the shiniest bread I've ever seen in my life, but it was a little hard on the crust, so we just had to eat the inside. That was when I was first married. Okay, I'm just going to say that. But the bread itself is just delicious. Do you think it's because of all the kneading that happens with the bread?
I think it's a lot. It's the combination of a lot of eggs and a lot of kneading.
Okay.
And really what we'll talk about in the next step is I think another key thing is the number of times and the length of time that you allow the bread to rise.
Okay.
If you're rushed and you don't have time for that, the bread will be good, but it will not be as good.
I see. So how many times do you get it to rise then?
So I normally do 3 rises. So I do, once we finish kneading the dough, we're going to put it into a greased bowl. So you can use some of that olive oil
Let's go ahead
that you
and
just
do
had.
that.
And you'll want to knead like I said, 10 to 15 minutes. The bread will become really smooth.
Okay.
And when you push into it, it'll bounce back.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. Now, when you say it's smooth, you won't see any more flour. It'll be like a consistency.
You'll
that's
incorporate all the flour fully. The outsides will be smooth and not shaggy, like you'll see when you first bring the dough over from your bowl. And then, the bread will start to be bouncy when you touch it.
So how long do you keep the bread in the knead after you knead it the first time? How long would you let it rise the first time?
So you would take the bowl, grease it, put your dough in, and then let it rise. I do the first rise normally an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how much. If you have the time, do a full hour and a half. Also depends on the weather. On a really humid day like today,
it is a humid day today.
It's going to rise much
faster.
faster. If it's cold, it'll take a lot longer.
Okay.
So if you're doing this in the middle of winter and it's cold and dry, you'll have to give your bread more time.
Now, how would you, if it is cold and your kitchen is rather cold, what would you do? Do you just not make bread? What do you do?
So in that case, what I'll normally do is I'll turn the oven on to 150, 180, turn it off. And then put the bowl of the dough in there and let it rise in the oven. And that helps a lot if you're dealing with a cold kitchen.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
That sounds good. All right, well, let's try the next step.
Okay.
Oh, this is such a pretty towel. I love that. That's so neat. It's lovely.
And this is how we want to keep it in the bowl. You want to put a warm, damp washcloth over it, and that will keep the top from drying out and just help with the rising process.
Do not use saran wrap. Is that what you do?
Some people do like to, but I prefer the towel.
Well, when you use saran wrap, when you pull it off, after that, it sticks so much. So I guess you could pam it down. But even when you pam it down, because it rises and there's a new surface, because of the rising, you're doomed. You're doomed on the saran wrap. All right, so with, I see you have some spray and you have a little bit of flour. Is that for your hands while you're doing?
So we're going to go ahead. Now we have some dough that has
Look at that.
been rising already. And we're going to braid it.
Can you show us the difference in the consistency when you put, oh, wow.
And it's nice and sticky. So sticky dough is hard to work with, but it usually means that it's going to taste good. So you just have to, rough it out when you're trying to braid.
Okay.
And we're gonna, I always go ahead and just spray the pan a little bit so nothing will stick. Okay. And this is the point where we would take a portion and separate it and say like, this is challah, and we would set this aside. So I'm just gonna set this here, and later I will dispose of it.
And that's your offering.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So with the dough for braiding, there's a million ways to braid challah. The most common is a 6-strand braid, and that's what you usually see in the pictures.
Wow.
It's a little complicated, so for the purpose of everybody trying it for the first time, we'll just do a 3-strand braid. Like you brought up before, for Rosh Hashanah, you'll do a circle. You'll see circle-shaped challahs. There's a tradition that the first Shabbat, I believe it's after Passover, is would people make key-shaped challah to unlock, financial success kind of idea. There's so many. You see people do turkey-shaped challahs for Thanksgiving. I mean, you can do whatever you want. There's a million ways. So what I normally do is I'll do a braided challah, and then I'll always make several rolls, because these are nice to have. Just if you're having 2 challahs at every meal. Yes. You might not go through 2 big loaves if you're just a couple people. A lot of times it's just my husband and I when we're here at the lake. So I'll make rolls for us. They're also nice to use later if you want to make a sandwich, or maybe for lunch on Shabbat you make a sandwich with them. So I usually do a mix of both.
Okay, sounds good.
So what we would do for the rolls, it's very easy. We would just take some of the challah dough and you just roll it out into a strand like this and just loop it around and through.
Oh, wow. Sort of like a knot.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly
Oh,
like a
lovely.
knot.
Well, that's wonderful.
So that one's easy.
I think we can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay.
And then to do our braided loaf, I'll take another portion.
Now, are you trying to achieve like 3 equal portions? Here, I'll hold it down for you a
Yeah,
little
so
bit.
when I have a set amount in mind, I'll go ahead and divide the dough up into, I want to have 3 rolls and 2 or 3 loaves. So I'll divide that out. Since we're just doing it for demonstration, I'm taking kind of a random amount.
I understand. That's cool.
So then we would take this piece that we have here, and since we're doing 3 strands, we would want to break it into 3 separate kind of balls of dough. And we want to make sure they're similar sizes. So this one's a little bit small. So I'm going to take from the others and just give it a little bit more. And like I said, this dough is very sticky. So I'm going to take a little flour.
It's nice to have that convenient flour.
Yeah. And we're going to go ahead and do the same thing where we're just rolling them out into these longer strands, sort of like ropes or snakes.
So a lot of times you can incorporate different things to use for the meal with the bread that you have, like maybe on that evening meal on Saturday that you talked about. So you can serve the bread any way. Is that correct? Or do you have to have it as a loaf just in your traditional dinners?
Yeah, so the tradition would be loaves, but you can braid it into different fun shapes if you want.
Or can you use it like you said, like a sandwich, or can you make French bread out of it or something like that?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good point. So for the purposes of making the blessing on the bread at the beginning of the meal, you do need 2 complete whole pieces.
Okay.
So whether
because
those are rolls
the 2
or
loaves, yeah.
So they can't be broken, they can't be cracked, they can't be cut or torn yet. So a lot of times if you want to use bread, if you want to make little sandwiches for lunch, you would have your big loaf and then cut slices, and people would sort of, if they have some deli out to make sandwiches or something like that. Okay. You can repurpose the challah later. So
I like that.
What's very popular in our house is to do challah French toast on Sunday. So leftover challah, especially a day or 2 later, it'll start to get just a tiny bit stale. And it makes amazing French toast. My husband's a huge fan. He'll eat it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And so we do that a lot with the leftovers.
Oh, I see. That does sound delicious. When we talk about the sunset on Friday through Saturday, I was raised Catholic, and we have a day of rest. Sunday is supposed to be our day of rest. It's amazing the similarities in religion. It's just that they're just a little different, some of them, but they're all kind of universal to having family time, personal time to reflect, to be spiritual. And it's fascinating. And I appreciate you sharing the information with us, because anytime you can learn about something new is wonderful.
Yeah, totally. And I love learning about different religions. I actually did a religious studies minor in college, so I liked taking classes about different faiths and learning. So it's very fun, and I'm happy to share.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. I really do. Okay, so we've got our 3.
We've got our 3 to braid. So when I first started making challah, I would often, what you'll see people do is pinch these at the top and start braiding. But what I learned through experience is that doesn't always lead to the most uniform braid.
Okay.
So what I find works better is actually to start in the middle, which may seem a little counterintuitive, but it works out well. So we're going to start with the 3, and we just will braid them like you would braid your hair.
Okay.
And just go down, and then we'll do the other side too.
Oh, I can see where that would make it much better and consistent in the look of it.
Yes. So you have, and you can, you mush it around and make it look the way you want. And then what I do at the ends is kind of when you get to the point where you can't braid anymore, you will pinch them together and fold them underneath.
Yeah.
Like that.
Oh, that's lovely. Now it looks so small. It doesn't look like it's going to feed a family right this
Yes.
minute, but
when you have something this size, it will turn out to be more like this size.
Wow.
And if you do a bigger braid, then you're going to start to see much bigger loaves.
Okay.
And I every single week underestimate how big the loaves will turn up. And my husband always teases me about it because once they're cooking in the oven, you'll start to see them poofing up and sort of pushing into each other. So just keep in mind when you make them how many people are going to be eating, and then add in the fact that it will get a lot bigger once we'll let it rise again, but it'll also continue to rise in the oven.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So once we have our braids and our rolls, however many we want to do, the next step is going to be to do an egg wash on them.
Okay.
So this is just one egg that's been cracked, and we've beaten it, and then add in just the teeniest bit of water, like just from your faucet. Turn it on, put the bowl in for a second, take it out, and incorporate that water, and then you have your egg wash.
Oh.
So what we do is we just put it completely over the challah, and we're going to do this before we let it rise again, and that will keep it from drying out while it's
nice.
rising in the kitchen.
Wow.
So we have this.
And does that give it the shiny consistency as well?
That gives it that nice darker brown, and that's usually what people like. Is you don't want like a really light colored challah. You want it to get really nice and dark in the oven, and that comes from the egg wash. There is something called water challah that some people make that has no eggs in it.
Oh, that would be good for
vegans.
Yes.
And it's something that some Sephardi Jews hold that if you have too much egg in your bread, then it's not really bread anymore. It's more like a cake.
Oh,
so they consider this kind of cakey. So they would do water challah instead.
I see.
And again, we'll let it rise again, but I'm just showing you that you could do another egg wash and then put some toppings.
Okay, now
so
what topping is that?
This is my favorite to do. It's everything but the bagel.
Oh yes, I love those bagels.
But a more traditional topping would be sesame seeds or poppy seeds, and you'll see that a lot if you see it at some challah at the supermarket. Mm-hmm. Another thing I like to do sometimes is do an herb challah. So just when you're making that dough in the beginning, just add a tablespoon of rosemary and a tablespoon of thyme, incorporate in the dough. And then what you would want to do during this step is sprinkle some herbs and some sea salt on top, and that does an herb challah. There's a million variations you can experiment.
That's nice.
But yes, so we would do our egg wash, let it rise again for 30 minutes, do another egg wash, do the topping, and then it will be ready to go into the oven.
Oh,
and
that's
so,
awesome.
yeah, it goes in the oven at 350. Let it bake for, I would say, 25 minutes and check on it. But it may need longer, especially if you've made particularly large loaves. The way you'll know that it's done is that you'll be able to pick up that loaf and knock on the bottom, and it will have a little bit of a hollow sound.
Oh, wow.
So
now, that sounds like where you would get the name from it, instead of the traditional reasoning. But that is fascinating. Yeah. Well, you did a wonderful job.
So that is,
and this is the finished product here.
And that's what the finished product will look like.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Well, we're going to have to cut that open.
Yeah.
Although, should we wait till sundown on Friday?
We will have, we've got challah in all its various stages. I think we'll have plenty for Shabbat this week.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your recipe with us and your traditions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another show of Cooking at the Lake. If you would like to have us come and share a simple recipe with you and your family, we would love to do that and show everybody how wonderful you can cook at the same time. So just contact us at maryjanewarner2501@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks again for having us.
Thank you.